My name is Amanda Schneido, and I'm here with one of the main authors of Theology of the Body for Teens, Brian Butler. And we want to welcome you to the training series of Theology of the Body for Teens. We hope this is an encouragement for you and a useful tool as you implement this curriculum with your teens. The theology of the body is a gift given to us by John Paul II. And it was meant not just for theologians to read and understand, but for the entire church, and especially our teens, who are fed so many lies in regard to the meaning and purpose of their bodies and of sexuality. What Brian Butler and Jason and Kristalina Everett have given us in Theology of the Body for Teens is invaluable because it makes these profound truths accessible and understandable for our teens. If the youth of our church can grasp this content, and they begin to preserve their own purity and train themselves in faithfulness, which will have an incredible impact on their own vocation and consequently the entire universal church. It is in those teenage years that we really search for meaning, and we're searching for the truth. And the way that teens are able to find that truth is when it's presented to them in a way that makes sense to them. The Theology of the Body for Teens reaches teens where they are so that this not only imparts knowledge in their mind, but also brings understanding and conversion of heart. So Brian, if you can just lead us through an overview of theology of the body in general. Often this can be overwhelming when we look at the writings of John Paul II, which is so beautiful, but also so intense. And when we begin to teach this to our teens, we can get lost in it. If you can just give us an overview of these beautiful teachings of JP2.
Well, I want to back up and as you said, start from the very beginning of what it is by using a little analogy that I think I used in the teen DVD series. And the analogy is, have you ever seen those 3D images? Mm-hmm. You know, they were real popular years ago.
You stare into the picture?
You stare at this picture and it's black and white and you see a bunch of squigglies. You don't really see anything other than that. And you're supposed to stare at a dot in the middle of the page and really focus there for a while and then pull out, and the image is supposed to jump off the page at you. I've never been very good at that at all. But the couple of times that I saw the image, I remember it was very stunning, you know, and I had two thoughts. The first thought was, why didn't I see that before? I mean, it was there the whole time, but I didn't see it. And the second thought was, as soon as I saw it, I wanted to show it to somebody else. And I wanted to be like, come on, look right there, see what's going on. Right. And I don't see it, look harder, because you want to share that insight with somebody. And I think that what we have going on in the theology of the body is a new understanding, a new way to look at what we've been experiencing for our whole lives. I've been, male my entire life, but in the last 6-7 years of my life, as I've started to understand this material, I'm looking at that page of my life and going, poof, and the image of who I am and who I'm called to be is jumping off the page at me. And I think that for all of our adults who are starting to dig into this to try to learn it for themselves in order to be able to translate it and help with teens for them to understand it, they're going to start to see the meaning of their own lives, jump off the page. And that's what teens are starting to see. So it's a very, very exciting experience because you start to understand yourself and your life in a whole new way, and it's all rooted in who I am as a man, as who you are and who you are as a woman, and going from there. And so that the big issue I think to remember is that John Paul II, in a certain sense, really saw humanity staring and saying, I don't get it, I don't get it, I don't get it. And he lived through that time in Poland, in Nazi Poland, when people were just being crushed. The dignity of the human person was being smeared. And he had very personal reasons to look for what does it mean to be human, and why did God make us the way he did, and are we living up to that? And so what I like to say is that in a certain sense he saw us looking at the page of our lives and not understanding, and he said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at the dot, and the dot is Christ. To stare at Christ in the middle of the picture of your life. And if you do that, and you follow his instructions at the bottom of the page, so to speak, that when you do that effectively, then the meaning of your life really will jump off the page at you, and you'll see things in a way that you never did before. And it reminds me of a quote that John Paul just really hammers throughout all of his pontificate, and especially through the Theology of the Body, from Gaudium et Spes, a document from Vatican II, where it says that Jesus Christ fully reveals man to himself and makes his supreme calling clear. And that's what this image is, where I look at Christ and I start to understand who I am and who I'm called to be in such a new way.
Right. And Brian, you talked about just our being created and seeing our root in Christ. What does it mean that we're created for love? I know in Theology of the Body, John Paul II talks a lot about that our whole meaning of being created is for love. What is this referring to?
Well, I think when we look at being created in the image and likeness of God, we've heard that phrase 5 billion times. And if you're a catechist or an adult, a youth minister, you've probably said it to your teens, many, many times. You're created in the image and likeness of God, but they don't get that. And I, for a long time, didn't really understand, what does it mean to be created in the image and likeness of God? And what it really means is, when we get back to seeing who God is, if we're created in His image and in His likeness, well, we have to look at, okay, who is God? And we know that God is love. Scripture tells us that in 1 John, that God is love. But what does love look like? And we start to see that love does not exist in isolation. It's shared between persons. There has to be multiple persons to share the gift that is love between people. And so actually in the early church, in 325, Council of Nicaea, there is a raging war going on over how to express and explain who God is. Specifically, it revolved around Christ, but whenever you deal with one person of the Trinity, you have to deal with all three. And so the church fathers were really wrestling with, how do we explain this? How do we explain who Christ is and His divinity as humanity? And they started to talk about the person at that point. They really started to talk about what it means to be a person, and end up talking about with the Trinity, that the Trinity is a communion of persons, and that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are equal, and it's one God, but they're distinct because of their relationship to one another. And so we start to see, when we start to talk about being created in the image and likeness of God, that we're created in the image and likeness of a relationship of love, that the Father is giving Himself completely to the Son's giving Himself completely to the Father, and that love is so powerful. There's a whole third person of the Holy Spirit that is there, this relationship, this communion of persons. So when we're created in the image and likeness of that, and we realize that's what we're destined for, to share in a love relationship like that, it changes everything.
Right. I think just the beauty of Theology of the Body is that it teaches us the meaning of love by looking, within ourselves, and then also at our own experiences as well. If you could just tell us just a little bit, what exactly does Theology of the Body mean? We refer to it so much, but what does that phrase even mean in itself?
Theology of the Body. We can start to stumble over the words, and especially when we start to talk to teens, and you say the word theology, they don't all know what you're talking about. No. So very simply, a good definition of theology is the study of God. And St. Anselm said that it's faith-seeking understanding. So when we speak about theology, we're trying to get to a deeper understanding of who God is. When we throw the words of the body on there, then we start to see that through the body and through the way that God created us as male and female, the meaning of who we are and who God is comes into clear focus. That it's revealed through the body, understanding more of who God is and who He's created us to be in relationship with Him and relationship with each other. We start to also see that the desires that we have reveal that. The desire for communion reflecting the communion of persons that we just talked about.
Well, in teaching and in helping out with youth ministry, I'm constantly reminded of the many challenges that our teens face today in this culture, and they have so many questions just about relationships and about sex and their bodies and about life in general. How do we take these incredible, profound truths that were given to us by John Paul II and bring them into their everyday experience and help them to connect and get it to click in their mind so it makes sense to them?
Well, I think the first thing that you mentioned is key, is that they have a lot of questions, and we need to let them know that that's okay. We need to let them know that it's good that they have questions. A person who's wise asks questions and seeks truth and seeks wisdom. So for them to be confused in this culture is really understandable.
Right.
And we need to let them be comfortable continuing to ask questions and continuing to seek with us what God wants for their lives and what the church teaches and how that synthesizes with their everyday relationships. And so, but let's take a minute and talk about teens. And let me ask you this. What characterizes teenagers today in your experience? You teach teens and work with them. What do you think characterizes them?
I just think there's a lot of things that I could think of. One is definitely an openness, that they want to understand life. They want to understand what's going on in this world. And so there's an openness and a hunger for the truth. And a lot of times they search for that through technological means, because everything in this culture is run by technology. So it's, the iPhone, it's, on the computer with everything's about their cell phones. And so they're constantly just trying to gain information through these instantaneous means, right, given to us in technology.
But is it all about information, do you think? I mean, when let's also think about that they're looking for their peer pressure, and they're wanting to be involved in sports on a team is really important. Band, they're in these group sort of things. So is it just information that they're looking for, or is it more than that?
Oh, absolutely more than that. Yeah. And when I think of they're looking for communion in a lot of ways. They're looking for relationships, or trying to figure out where their niche is in a certain group. They feel very uncomfortable being alone or having a moment of silence, even because they're always hearing the noise. Yes. And so they're looking for that, relationship. Yeah,
and as I talk to youth ministers and catechists across the country, they're all saying a lot of the similar things that we just talked about, that these are the things that characterize teens. Technology, a hunger to be a part of something bigger than who they are, and that's characterized through the teams and group things and stuff like that. A hunger for the truth, as you talked about, a desire for real freedom, a desire for to be different, sometimes to be able to kind of set out from their own path, to have things be different than maybe they were in their own family if they're having a rough family life. And at the bottom of all that, what I see as the common denominator at the end of the day is that the teen who texts, 100 times a day is not because they love the cell phone, really, which is what we can sometimes think. But they're looking for a relationship. Yeah. There's a person on the other side of that text message. There's a person on the other side of my Facebook message. There's a person on the other side of all the technology and the teams that I'm a part of and all that. There's people there that I want to be in relationship with. I want to be included. I don't want to be excluded. I don't want to be left alone. Right. And that's one of the deepest fears that we have as human beings, is to be left alone. And so I think that when we look at them and we see that they're, on one hand, they're really craving love, and that's one of the things that's at the bottom of what they desire. But then we have this other side of the way that they express things, where they're very very, very busy, right? The teens are very busy. They're distracted. They're media saturated. They're spending so much time watching TV and internet and things like that. Then we start to talk about sexuality, and they're oversexed. Sure. They're underdressed, and I like to say that they're primed and ready for the theology of the body. That there's absolutely. Through their very bodies, they're expressing this desire for communion, the desire for love, and they're screaming for an answer to it. And I think, and a lot of people who are working in this field believe that this theology of the body is a gift that God gave, through John Paul II to the church and to this generation, exactly what they need when they needed it. Sure. I think too of John Paul II's quote that we actually have up here, that the fundamental and innate vocation of every human being is love. And that's essentially what you're saying, that behind all those desires and all those things is this desire for love. Exactly. It's a great quote that encapsulates the beginning of what all the theology of the body means. Who is this relevant to? Sometimes we can start to think that people will, unfortunately, maybe drop theology of the body in a certain box, that it's in the marriage box, or it's in the chastity box, or it's in this box or that box, and really limit it. But at the end of the day, it's about love, and about how we experience love as male and female through our bodies, with each other and with God. And so that's a great quote. There's another one that I have from John Paul II, from his first encyclical, which was Redemptor Hominis, the Redeemer of Man. And you get a good sense of where a pope's going with his whole pontificate, with his first encyclical. Like we recently saw with Pope Benedict, God is love. He was coming back to the basics. And John Paul, in this first encyclical, he says, man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible to himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it. And that quote just screams teenagers to me, because they are so confused about so many things because they haven't experienced a deep, intimate, personal love with God. They oftentimes have not had that relationship with God because there's a screen or a smoke screen there with their own relationships with their families and with friends and with guys and girls of the opposite sex. Those relationships are broken. They're deteriorating. They're falling apart. And so I'm not able to experience love as God wants me to, and therefore my life doesn't make any sense to me. I'm looking at the page of my life, going back to the page, and I don't understand what it's all about. And so when they're missing out on love, and then they start to maybe act out, we forget as adults, we forget that it's really a symptom. How easy I can think of so many times where I, misread a teen acting out. And I thought it was the problem instead of the symptom of what their deeper issue was. One of the things that I'm reminded of is when I was teaching high school, I was substituting a class one day. Teachers, you love that.
Oh,
you get the pink
it's
slip
a favorite thing in the world.
Right? And so I had to go in the afternoon. It's a Friday, and I've got these ninth grade boys, and I'm sitting there and I kind of give them, hey, you do your work, I'll do mine, and we'll be fine. And 10 minutes in, maybe, this kid walks up to my desk and takes a silver dollar and drops it on my desk and says, somebody hit me in the head with that. In the class, and I'm like, oh, here it goes. So I started doing my investigation and trying to figure out what it's all about and how this came about. I use every trick that I know, and I can't get anybody to confess that they hit him with this thing, and nothing's working, and there's no motive. I'm in CSI. I'm just looking for all the clues, and so I finally, the end of the period is gone. I've done all this stuff. I got nothing. So I take him outside at the end of the period, and I'm like, "Did you make this up?" I'm grilling him, and I'm getting angry. That he wasted my period, everybody's time, and he kind of puts his head down and he says yes, and I'm like, why, and he starts kind of shaking like this, and I said, why did you make that up? And he said, I don't know. He said, I don't know. And as adults, we're like, do not tell me you don't know. That infuriates adults when a kid does something and then it seems premeditated and you're like, why'd you do that? I don't know. And then he starts crying, and so I took him into a side room and I asked him what was really going on, and he said, well, my dad, left when I was a kid, when I was just a baby, and he's been living in another state for 14 years, and I just got a letter from him recently saying he wants me to come live with him. Oh, wow. And so now I have to choose whether I go meet my dad, who I've never known, or do I stay with my mom, who I love and who's here, and I don't know what to do. And that was what was eating at him, and he just had this other symptom of him acting out because he didn't know how to deal with that. And that's a relationship issue, but there's plenty of them that our teens are dealing with that are different than that one, that we see things going on and they don't make sense to us, and it's easy for us to jump on teenagers. I think that one of the gifts of this theology of the body is helping us to look deeper, to see the fundamental vocation of love that we're all called to, and when that's broken, that we need to love these young people and help them to understand the roots of their issues, so that they can experience the love that God has wanted for them.
Well, I think too, a lot of times they're asking for the truth, they're asking for a deeper meaning, but they ask with immaturity.
Exactly.
The questions don't come across exactly in the way that they're intending for them to come across.
Because they can't speak like we can. They can't articulate things the same way that an adult can. They can't really come around big ideas with short words. They just are searching the whole time,
Right.
and so that's a great point. And I think because of the fact that they don't know who they are and they're searching so hard, their actions sometimes seem directionless. Like they have no direction, and I'm just wandering around, and I'm doing this and it makes no sense, and I'm doing that and it makes no sense. And it stresses us adults out,
Right.
stresses parents out, of like, why is my teenager doing this? 6 months ago he was fine, and now
Right.
he's off in this direction and doing something that doesn't make any sense. But I think that's what John Paul II saw happening. He saw us all as humanity. He saw us wandering. He saw us looking for who we really are, who we're really called to be, forgetting what that it really was supposed to be. And so he kind of takes us back to the origin of where our dignity comes from and how that's connected to our life and our relationships and who we're called to be.
And how did John Paul II go about giving us all these teachings in theology of the body?
Well, let's actually go to the board for a minute. I know teachers love to use the board, so I'm going to use the board. And just for a minute, talk about exactly where theology of the body came from and how it's structured, because that can be a good thing for us to know before we get into the nitty-gritty of the curriculum of this curriculum, is to really look into where did it come from. So the theology of the body is actually a composite of 129 different short talks or addresses that John Paul II delivered between 1979 and 1984 in St. Peter's Square. Later on, actually, they found that there were 6 more that were undelivered, for a total of 135 addresses that he gave. And they were consistent on one topic throughout, and it was about humanity, about who am I as a man, who am I as a woman, and how are we called to live. And so that's the theme throughout the whole thing. And actually, I'm going to show you here, this is the standard translation now for the theology of the body. Man and woman, he created them, a theology of the body, by John Paul II. It's translated by Dr. Michael Wallstein, who's done a great service. His introduction to this masterpiece is itself a great contribution to people who are studying the theology of the body. So if you are going to dig into it in a deeper way, this is what you want to have. But when we look at it, and we try to look at it can be John Paul's writing is difficult sometimes, obviously, and so it's very important for us to get to the structure of what he was doing, to really be able to see that. So I'm going to show you that really quickly here, and there's 2 main parts of this. The first part is the words of Christ. And there are 3 different subsections of that. And the first is that Christ appeals to the beginning. The second part is that he appeals to the human heart. And the third is that he appeals to our destiny. He looks towards the resurrection. That's where our final destiny is. So that's part 1. Part 2 is actually where Christ is starting to now apply this and help us to understand. The first part is all about establishing what John Paul II calls an adequate anthropology. And so as he sets out to do that, the second part is starting to apply that adequate anthropology. And he calls it, the second part is called the sacrament. We're going to get more into later on understanding what he means when he says sacrament. And so the first part of it is called the dimension of the covenant and grace. And the second part, I hope you can see this, is the dimension of the sign, where he starts to apply, starts to look at marriage, starts to look at celibacy. These are key things in that section. And then the last part is actually where he looks at, does reflections on Humanae Vitae and on love and fruitfulness. And so I'm actually going to erase this here so I can get to that next part, part 3. The part 3 would really be, the final part really is about, as I just said a moment ago, is about Humanae Vitae, that landmark document that Pope Paul VI wrote and released in 1968, July of 1968, that so many people didn't understand. And so his reflections, that final part, are on Humanae Vitae. Now that's the original structure. There's an alternative structure that some people use in order to better understand it, and I'm going to show you that, that as well. And it would go, well, actually, I'm going to erase this for you. So part 1 is a question. It's who am I? And underneath who am I, you have these 3 main areas that we look at John Paul, as we said a moment ago, establishing that adequate anthropology. So the first part is called original man. We'll get into what that term means later on. The second part is called historical man. And the third part is eschatological man. So these are 3 parts of who we are as humans. We look at the beginning with original man as far as where we came from. Historical man is the second part, which is our history. And the breakdown there is from the fall of Adam to the end of time is what historical man is. So this is where we live. We live in this time period. And then the third part of eschatological man is about our destiny, about where we're headed towards heaven. Okay. So part 2 is, again, as we said a moment ago, is about establishing this adequate anthropology. And so who am I establishes our identity. And the second part is now about our mission. So it's how am I called? How am I to live? How am I to live? What's my real purpose to live in love? How am I to live in a way that's going to bring me happiness? And so that second part is then broken down like this, where he looks at celibacy for the kingdom. He looks at marriage. And then love and fruitfulness, which is, as we said a moment ago, is reflections on Humanae Vitae. Okay, so you have the origin the adequate anthropology of where have I come from, where am I now, and where am I going, which is just to establish who humanity is and who I am as an individual part of that humanity. And then the second is, okay, once I understand who am I, then, well, how am I called to live? So this second part is all about 2 things. It's about ethics, okay, or morality. It answers questions like that, and it also answers the question of vocation, of how am I called specifically to live out my call to love. So that's an alternative structure. Now, not to disappoint you, but we understand teens, and the authors of the program, myself, Jason and Kristalina Everett, we decided that actually we were going to deviate a little bit from these structures for the teenagers, because we felt like it would be easier for them to dive in if we were to kind of push some of the buttons that we knew would help give them a lot of desire to continue learning. But we didn't change the content. So you'll see this content within our curriculum as we're going to go through it, but we did change a little bit of the order. So just be aware of that. But that's in a nutshell, where we are when we start to talk about the theology of the body. Now, for just a moment, actually, I'm going to say a bit more on this structure as to the three words of Christ. We've mentioned that there was three words of Christ, but we didn't talk about what they were. The first one is that actually in John Paul's first address is when he is sitting there being grilled by the Pharisees, and they're asking him, Moses used to allow us to divorce, but you say we can't. Why not? What's going on there? And he points and says that Moses allowed you to divorce because of your hardness of heart, but from the beginning it was not so. And that section where he then unfolds what it is, what the beginning is about. He goes back to Genesis, to Adam and Eve, to really help us to understand our origin. That's the whole section on original man. So it's based off of the first word of Christ, of that triptych of the words of Christ, which comes from Matthew 19. The second section on historical man looks at where we are now, and the second word of Christ is when he is actually giving the Sermon on the Mount. And when he's giving the Sermon on the Mount, it's from Matthew 5, 27 and 28, where he says, "You shall not commit adultery. Everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And so what John Paul helps us to see is that we live during this time where we are afflicted with concupiscence. We have a tendency towards sin. There's something going on in our human heart that wants to go away from the original plan that God gave us of perfect love, pure love in this section of original man. But we're not left to our own devices to just cope with all of this in historical man, because at the center of historical man is where God comes in to save the day, when he takes on human flesh himself, and Christ is at the center of our humanity in historical man. And what does he bring us? He brings us hope. He brings us redemption, that we can actually change, and the desires of our hearts that have been twisted can actually be changed here. So our origin now, we have problems here in historical man, but Christ is in the middle to bring us out of it, to help us to change, to be redeemed. And then he points us towards this third section of eschatological man, of our destiny, of where it is that we're headed. And that third word of Christ that John Paul focuses on, or brings a lot of his meditations off of, comes from Matthew 22, where he says that in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And so he helps us to understand what does that mean? What did Jesus mean when he said that? Where is marriage in this whole picture? Because marriage is very much at the beginning of what he talks about in original man, of the marriage of Adam and Eve, that this is how we were created. It's very much the question in historical man of adultery in our heart, even a man towards his wife, or a wife towards her husband, that there would be a problem there inside of marriage. And then again, in eschatological man, pointing us towards where we are, that when we are in the resurrection, we're neither going to marry or be given away in marriage, yet that's all about the marriage of the Lamb, that Christ is wedded to his bride, the church. That's where we are finally in complete communion, the communion that we've all been destined for. So that's that whole first part. And then the second part, as I explained a moment ago, where he looks into much deeper way into what does it mean to be celibate for the kingdom specifically. Not just that I'm single by circumstance, but with priesthood and religious life and whatnot. What does it mean to sacrifice the marriage of earth in order to participate in a certain sense here and now and point towards our ultimate destiny of the marriage of Christ and the church in heaven? And then he looks into, in a deeper way, into marriage and how men and women, what are their roles and how are they imaging the life of Christ and the church. We gets into that in that second part of the second part. And then the fruit of that, love and fruitfulness. How does that relationship image the communion of persons that we talked about a few moments ago? How does it image God himself? And it's a beautiful set of teachings that we're really gonna really get into in a much deeper way throughout as we look through all the chapters, which we're going to do in a little while.
So thank you, Brian. That was a lot. And just for the sake of all of our viewers as well, just to not get overwhelmed at this, because I think we can look at all of these teachings of John Paul II that he delivered over a 5-year period, and we're just giving an overview, right? And I just want to reassure again all those that are, just preparing to teach this curriculum, that you're not going to have to recreate this for your teens. That's in essence what Brian and Jason and Crystalina have already done in Theology of the Body for Teens, but that it's helpful for us to know where this came from and the way in which John Paul II wrote it, so we can see his original intention and flow of things and how we're going to try to bring that to our teens. If we can just go through, there are a few key terms in there that I think maybe we could just define a little bit more to make sure we're all on the same page.
Sure.
I know one, Humanae Vitae. I know that's an incredible encyclical by Pope Paul VI. If you could just tell us what is the translation of that in English?
On human life.
Right.
And obviously in the 60s there's a whole lot going on there regarding the understanding of sexuality and parenthood, and so Pope Paul VI wrote this encyclical to help articulate the Church's teaching on love and fruitfulness, on responsible parenthood, on what it means to be married, to have the gift of sexuality represent God's love as it should. So Humanae Vitae is that landmark document that sat for many people undiscovered for a long time. A lot of people maybe thought they knew what it was about, and maybe a lot of people today still, as I teach this to adults and stuff like that, I always tell them that let's have an open mind, open heart here to try it for the first time again, to see what it is that the Church is teaching. So that's what Humanae Vitae is about.
Sure. Also, too, you mentioned adequate anthropology. If you could just explain what exactly that means. I know that term sometimes we don't use very regularly, but just when you refer to an adequate anthropology, what is that?
Well, anthropology, we know is a study of man, and so when John Paul set out to do an adequate anthropology, I think what he was going after is that we have lost an understanding of who we are as men and women. He was, as I mentioned earlier, he was looking at the Holocaust, and he's got that in his mind. He's got communism in his mind. He's got totalitarianism in his mind. He sees all these different ways that people are just being crushed, and therefore have we forgotten what it means to be human? Right. And so when he sets out to establish an adequate anthropology, he's saying, well, we need to understand our story from start to finish in order to understand who we really are. You can't just skip to the end of the story, or just read the middle of the story, or just read the beginning. It's all together. So this outline of who is man in the very beginning, who are we now, and where are we headed, is that structure that he gave us to understand adequately who we are as men and women.
Sure. Just one more term, if we could just break it open and define it a little bit more, and that's eschatological man. Can you just explain what that means?
Well, the root is eschatology. And eschatology is a study of the last things. And so when we talk about eschatological man, we're talking about what are the last things for man? Where are we headed in our destiny? And that's it. We're destined for heaven. We're destined to be with God. God created us to be with Him for forever. And so some of those terms sound difficult, but their import is not that difficult to understand. Right. When we get to where we were, where are we now, and where are we headed? Yeah,
absolutely. I've heard it said that theology of the body is a new delivery system for our faith, which is a really intense thing to say, right? This is a new way to deliver our entire faith. What would you say to that?
It is an intense thing to say. It's a bold statement to talk about a new delivery system for the entire faith. But when we remember that Pope John Paul II spent 5 years of his life dedicating to this one big topic, I know that I get impatient giving 4 talks on one topic. So for him to dedicate 5 years of his life to it tells us a lot about how important it is. And then when we also remember the audience that he was teaching, that he was giving these Wednesday audiences in St. Peter's Square to people from all over the world, he was really intending it for everyone, for the universal church, and he's using his office as Bishop of Rome. He's a teacher, as Pope, to teach the church on these very important issues. So we start to see how important that is, to be able to understand more of our faith. And then when we remember things like George Weigel, who's John Paul II's biographer, he said that as we start to unpack this theology of the body, it's going to affect the way that we understand virtually every major theme in the creed. And in addition to that, Dr. Michael Wallstein, who did this latest translation, has said that it's a new lens through which to reread the entire catechism.
Wow.
So it's an exciting thing to look at our teenagers and know that we're not just teaching them one little thing. When youth ministers and teachers are starting to unpack this program, it's really got long-lasting effects on how I understand myself, on how I see the church, on how I see the world, on how I see my relationships. And there's so much freedom and liberation in this vision of life and love that I'm getting excited. We're just at the beginning of this training, but I'm excited about it. So I hope that everybody at home, as they're learning, is ready to walk with us and continue to dig into how that can impact the life and the futures of their teens.
Absolutely. We just encourage you to stick with us as we continue to work through this curriculum. In our next session, Brian is going to lead us through the methodology of the curriculum so you can understand what is all there and how you implement that to your teens. Thank you, and we are praying for you.